The modern agricultural narrative is built on a fragile assumption that the supply chain is a permanent feature of reality. We are taught to view food as something that travels. It is harvested, processed, packaged, and shipped. This logistical chain requires crops that are compliant. They must be uniform, they must fit into crates, and they must survive the journey from the farm to the supermarket shelf. But there is a biological cost to this convenience. To create a food system based on transport, we had to abandon the food systems based on resilience. We traded durability for portability. The potato is the perfect example of this trade. It is the king of the modern diet, yet it is biologically pathetic when stripped of its infrastructure. Leave a potato in the ground through a hard freeze, and it turns to mush. It dies. It requires a climate-controlled warehouse, a rootcellar, or a heated basement to survive the winter. It demands energy to be stored. If the grid fails, the potato harvest rots. But there is another tuber, a native technology of the North American continent, that operates on an entirely different set of physics. It does not fear the frost, it requires it. While the potato is dying in the frozen mud, this plant is converting its starches into anti-freeze, becoming sweeter, denser, and more caloric as the temperature drops. It uses the frozen earth as its refrigerator. It thrives where the supply chain ends. This is the Jerusalem artichoke, the sunroot, the biological battery that the industrial food system tried to erase because it made the consumer too independent. The erasure of the sunroot was not an accident of history. It was a necessity of economics. Before the colonization of the Americas standardized the diet of the world, indigenous populations understood that survival was not about hoarding grain in a silo, but about living within a landscape that produced calories perennially. The sunroot was a cornerstone of this strategy. It was not farmed in neat rows. It was established in patches that acted as famine insurance. Early European settlers survived their first brutal winters solely because of this tuber. It was exported to Europe in the 1600s and was initially hailed as a miracle crop. But then, the Industrial Revolution began to reshape agriculture. The potato rose to dominance not because it was nutritionally superior, it is not, but because it was a commodity. The potato could be harvested all at once, creating a momentary surplus that forced the farmer to sell or store. The sunroot, however, defied this logic. Its skin is thin. It dries out quickly once removed from the soil. It resists being turned into a product. It demands to be left in the ground until the moment it is needed. This characteristic made it useless to the merchant, but invaluable to the survivor. The merchant cannot sell a crop that stores best in the customer's backyard. And so, the sunroot was reclassified. It went from a staple food to a weed, relegated to the edges of fields and the memories of the desperate, while the world built its caloric foundation on crops that require a functioning civilization to exist. To understand the logistical superiority of the sunroot, one must look at the mechanics of winter survival. In a grid-down scenario or a disruption of transport lines, the primary enemy is not just hunger, it is preservation. Calories are useless if they spoil. The modern prepper stockpiles freeze-dried meals or cans, trading space and money for a finite buffer. The sunroot offers an infinite buffer. It is a perennial crop, meaning it returns every year without replanting. Once established, a patch of sunroots is a self-replicating calorie vault. The logistical genius lies in its harvest window. Most crops are harvested in the fall. The sunroot can be harvested throughout the winter and into the early spring, precisely the hunger gap when stored supplies run low and game is scarce. You do not need a root cellar. You do not need electricity. You do not need to process it. The soil itself, frozen hard as stone, protects the tuber. In fact, the chemistry of the plant relies on this cold. The carbohydrate structure of the tuber changes after a frost, breaking down indigestible inulin into fructose, making the root more palatable and energy-dense. It is a food source that improves as the conditions for human life deteriorate. While your neighbors are counting cans of beans, the ground beneath your feet is holding thousands of pounds of fresh food, locked away in a vault that no looter can easily raid and no power outage can destroy. History has already run the simulation on this. We do not need to speculate about the sunroot's value in a collapse. We have the documentation of the Second World War. When the machinery of Europe was dismantled by conflict, the distribution of potatoes and grains was seized by occupying forces or disrupted by bombing. The supply lines stopped. The supermarkets, or their equivalents, were empty. In this vacuum, the weed returned. The Jerusalem artichoke, which grew wild in the ditches and abandoned lots, became the primary fuel for populations under siege. It was known as the war vegetable. People who had been taught to view it as pig fodder suddenly realized it was the only thing keeping them alive. It grew without fertilizer. It grew without pesticides. It grew in the bomb craters and the rubble. It did not need the system that had failed them. This historical pivot reveals the true nature of the plant. It is a crisis crop. It lies dormant in the cultural consciousness during times of plenty, only to emerge when the artificial structures of society are stripped away. It is the biological backup plan that nature installed in the soil, waiting for the moment when human arrogance collapses under its own weight. The numbers behind this plant are staggering, almost violent in their efficiency. Modern industrial agriculture celebrates yields of corn and soy that are heavily subsidized by petrochemical fertilizers and irrigation. The sunroot competes with these giants with zero input. A single acre of Jerusalem artichokes can yield between 15 to 20 tons of tubers. Compare this to potatoes, which require meticulous care to reach similar tonnages, or wheat, which yields a fraction of that biomass. But the yield is only half the equation. The caloric density is the real weapon. The sunroot is an energy-dense carbohydrate source that requires no arable land. It thrives in poor soil, in clay, in sand, and in areas where traditional crops fail. It is drought-resistant and disease-resistant. It is so aggressive in its growth that it is often classified as invasive. This invasiveness is exactly what you want in a survival crop. You want a plant that fights for its life. You want a plant that outcompetes weeds, that cannot be killed by neglect, that expands its territory year after year. While the modern farmer fights nature to keep his corn alive, the sunroot grower watches nature do the work. It is a caloric return on investment that defies the laws of modern economics. Science has recently begun to decode why this famine food is actually superior to the staples that replaced it. The primary carbohydrate in the sunroot is inulin, not starch. This distinction is critical. Starch converts rapidly into glucose, spiking blood sugar and creating the metabolic instability that plagues the modern world. Inulin is a prebiotic fiber. It passes through the upper digestive tract unchanged and is fermented by the gut bacteria in the colon. It feeds the microbiome. In a survival situation, immune health is paramount. A diet of white rice and canned meat destroys gut health, leaving the survivor vulnerable to dysentery and infection. The sunroot protects the internal biology of the survivor. It regulates blood sugar, improves mineral absorption, and strengthens the immune system from the inside out. It is not just empty calories. It is functional medicine. The plant also sequesters carbon at a rate that dwarfs annual crops, rebuilding the soil structure as it grows. It is a regenerative technology. The weed that was cast aside turns out to be a sophisticated biological machine that addresses the nutritional deficiencies inherent in a grain-based diet. The suppression of the sunroot is a case study in the economics of dependency. Why is this superfood not in every grocery store? Why is it not a staple of the school lunch? Because it breaks the model of centralized control. The food industry is built on shelf life and transportability. A potato can be dug up in Idaho, stored for 6 months, treated with sprout inhibitors, and sold in Florida. A sunroot shrivels if it is kept out of the soil for more than a week or two. It demands to be eaten locally. It demands to be eaten seasonally. It cannot be commodified on a global scale. This flaw is its greatest strength for the individual, but it is a fatal defect for the corporation. The corporation cannot own the sunroot market because the storage facility is the earth itself, which is owned by the grower. By removing the sunroot from the cultural menu, the system ensures that the population remains dependent on the supply chain. If you can grow your own winter survival calories with zero effort, you are less likely to panic when the shelves go empty. You are less likely to accept the prices dictated by the monopoly. The erasure of this plant was a strategic move to eliminate the autonomy of the eater. This is not an isolated incident. It is part of a pattern of agricultural simplification that has left us dangerously exposed. We see the same logic applied to amaranth, to acorns, to cattails. Every region of the world has a lost crop that was once the backbone of survival, replaced by a generic cultivar that requires industrial inputs. We have traded biodiversity for efficiency, But efficiency is brittle. A system that is 100% efficient has zero redundancy. When a blight hits the potato crop, as it did in Ireland, the result is catastrophe. When a drought hits the wheat belt, the result is famine. The sunroot represents the chaos of nature, which is the only true form of stability. It is genetic diversity. It is the chaotic variable that the spreadsheet cannot account for. By ignoring these plants, we have built a civilization on a foundation of sand, assuming that the weather will always be predictable and the trucks will always run. We have forgotten that for 99% of human history, survival depended on plants that could fight the weather, not plants that needed to be protected from it. But the climate is forcing a return. The predictable seasons that allowed for the dominance of the potato and the cornstalk are ending. We are entering an era of erratic weather, of polar vortexes plunging into temperate zones, of droughts followed by floods. The delicate, high-maintenance crops of the industrial age are failing. The potato cannot handle the new extremes. The sunroot can. It evolved in the harsh fluctuations of the North American continent. It is built for this instability. As the industrial food system begins to fracture under the stress of a changing climate, the weeds will once again become the staples. The gardener who plants sunroots today is not just gardening. They are terraforming their future. They are installing a biological safety net that will catch them when the artificial one snaps. The forced return to these resilient crops is inevitable. The only question is whether you will adopt them by choice before the crisis, or by necessity after it. Planting the Jerusalem artichoke is an act of secession from the fragile systems of the modern world. It is a declaration that you do not trust the supply chain to feed your children in January. It is a rejection of the storage monopoly. When you put that tuber in the ground, you are locking in a calorie source that requires no electricity, no gasoline, and no permission to access. You are turning your frozen, dormant soil into a living pantry. The world may freeze, the grid may shudder and fail, and the trucks may stop coming. But the sunroot will be there, waiting under the frost, sweeter and stronger than the day it was planted. It is the ultimate technology of the silent harvest, a technology that works best when the world stops working. If the power grid fails in January, does your garden become a graveyard or a pantry? Why were we taught to fear the plant that loves the frost?